Elastography, Wikipedia audio. Elastography is a medical imaging modality that maps the elastic properties and stiffness of soft tissue. The main idea is that whether the tissue is hard or soft will give diagnostic information about the presence or status of disease. For example, cancerous tumors will often be harder than the surrounding tissue, and diseased livers are stiffer than healthy ones. The most prominent techniques use ultrasound or magnetic resonance imaging to make both the stiffness map and an anatomical image for comparison. Elastography is used for the investigation of many disease conditions in many organs. It can be used for additional diagnostic information compared to a mere anatomical image, and it can be used to guide biopsies or, increasingly, replace them entirely. Biopsies are invasive and painful, presenting a risk of infection, whereas elastography is completely non-invasive. Applications: Elastography is used to investigate disease in the liver. Liver stiffness is usually indicative of fibrosis or steatosis, which are in turn indicative of numerous disease conditions, including cirrhosis and hepatitis. Elastography is particularly advantageous in this case because when fibrosis is diffuse, a biopsy can easily miss sampling the diseased tissue, which results in a false negative misdiagnosis. Naturally, elastography sees use for organs and diseases where manual palpation was already widespread. Elastography is used for detection and diagnosis of breast, thyroid, and prostate cancers. Certain types of elastography are also suitable for musculoskeletal imaging, and they can determine the mechanical properties and state of muscles and tendons. Pushing/deforming or vibrating the surface of the body or organ with a probe or a tool, using radiation force of focused ultrasound to remotely create a push inside the tissue, and using distortions created by normal physiological processes, e.g. pulse or heartbeat. Because elastography does not have the same limitations as manual palpation, it is being investigated in some areas for which there is no history of diagnosis with manual palpation. For example, magnetic resonance elastography is capable of assessing the stiffness of the brain, and there is a growing body of scientific literature on elastography in healthy and diseased brains. Preliminary reports on elastography used on transplanted kidneys to evaluate cortical fibrosis have been published showing promising results. Palpation is the practice of feeling the stiffness of a patient's tissues with the practitioner's hands. Manual palpation dates back at least to 1500 BC, with the Egyptian Ebers Papyrus and Edwin Smith Papyrus both giving instructions on diagnosis with palpation. In ancient Greece, Hippocrates gave instructions on many forms of diagnosis using palpation, including palpation of the breasts, wounds, bowels, ulcers, uterus, skin, and tumors. In the modern Western world, palpation became considered a respectable method of diagnosis in the 1930s. Since then, the practice of palpation has become widespread, and it is considered an effective method of detecting tumors and other pathologies. Manual palpation, however, suffers from several important limitations. It is limited to tissues accessible to the physician's hand, it is distorted by any intervening tissue, and it is qualitative but not quantitative. Elastography, the measurement of tissue stiffness, seeks to address these challenges. Tactile imaging, also called mechanical imaging, stress imaging or computerized palpation, is a medical imaging modality that translates the sense of touch into a digital image. There are numerous elastographic techniques, in development stages from early research to extensive clinical application. Each of these techniques works in a different way. What all methods have in common is that they create a distortion in the tissue, observe and process the tissue response to infer the mechanical properties of the tissue, and then display the results to the operator, usually as an image. Each elastographic method is characterized by the way it does each of these things. For a given applied force, stiffer tissue deforms less than does softer tissue. Mechanical waves travel faster through stiffer tissue than through softer tissue. To image the mechanical properties of tissue, we need to see how it behaves when deformed. There are three main ways of inducing a distortion to observe. These are: the primary way elastographic techniques are categorized is by what imaging modality they use to observe the response. Elastographic techniques use ultrasound, magnetic resonance imaging and pressure/stress sensors in tactile imaging. There are a handful of other methods that exist as well. Historical background. The observation of the tissue response can take many forms. In terms of the image obtained, it can be 1D, 2D, or 3D, or just a single value, and it can either be a video or a single image. In most cases, the result is displayed to the operator along with a conventional image of the tissue, which shows where in the tissue the different stiffness values occur. Once the response has been observed, the stiffness can be calculated from it. Most elastography techniques find the stiffness of tissue based on one of two main principles. Some techniques will simply display the distortion and/or response, or the wave speed to the operator, while others will compute the stiffness and display that instead. Some techniques present results quantitatively, while others only present qualitative results. There are great many ultrasound elastographic techniques. In quasi-static elastography, an external compression is applied to tissue, and the ultrasound images before and after the compression are compared. The areas of the image that are least deformed are the ones that are the stiffest, while the most deformed areas are the least stiff. Generally, what is displayed to the operator is an image of the relative distortions, which is often of clinical utility. From the relative distortion image, however, making a quantitative stiffness map is often desired. To do this requires that assumptions be made about the nature of the soft tissue being imaged and about tissue outside of the image. Additionally, under compression, objects can move into or out of the image or around in the image, causing problems with interpretation. Another limit of this technique is that, like manual palpation, it has difficulty with organs or tissues that are not close to the surface or easily compressed. Acoustic radiation force impulse imaging and shear wave elasticity imaging are related techniques. The main difference between SWEI and ARFI is that SWEI is based on the use of shear waves propagating laterally from the beam axis and creating elasticity map by measuring shear wave propagation parameters, whereas ARFI gets elasticity information from the axis of the pushing beam and uses multiple pushes to create a 2D stiffness map. How it works. Inducing a distortion. Magnetic resonance elastography was introduced in the mid-1990s, and multiple clinical applications have been investigated. In MRE, a mechanical vibrator is used on the surface of the patient's body. This creates shear waves that travel into the patient's deeper tissues. An imaging acquisition sequence that measures the velocity of the waves is used, and this is used to infer the tissue's stiffness. The result of an MRE scan is a quantitative 3D map of the tissue stiffness, as well as a conventional 3D MRI image. Observing the response. Processing and presentation. Ultrasound elastography. Magnetic resonance elastography. Tactile imaging. One strength of MRE is the resulting 3D elasticity map, which can cover an entire organ. Because MRI is not limited by air or bone, it can access some tissues ultrasound cannot, notably the brain. It also has the advantage of being more uniform across operators and less dependent on operator skill than most methods of ultrasound elastography. Mr. Elastography has made significant advances over the past few years with acquisition times down to a minute or less and has been used in a variety of medical applications including cardiology research on living human hearts. Mr. Elastography's short acquisition time also make it competitive with other elastography techniques. Many physical principles have been explored for the realization of tactile sensors, resistive, inductive, capacitive, optoelectric, magnetic, piezoelectric and electroacoustic principles, in a variety of configurations. Other techniques. These include elastography with optical coherence tomography. Notes.